Mr. Searle.
Thank you, Chair. Treasurer, you described the fire and emergency services levy reforms, I think in March of this year, as this levy forms one of the most significant pieces of tax reform in New South Wales for generations. And you also said a significant amount of work has gone into making sure we have the best tax system possible. Do you remember saying those words?
Sounds familiar.
Hauntingly familiar.
Just familiar.
Well, do you still think that that's the best description of those reforms?
Well, I think we would agree on the principle that a levy on insurance premiums paid by only those people who have a policy who take out insurance to pay for the important work of our emergency services personnel is certainly not the most efficient or the fairest system of, I guess, collecting that levy. It is an accident of history. I think the Labor Party, even the Greens, may agree on the principle, that principle. Certainly, as you know, that the reforms of the Fire and Emergency Services Levy were deferred.
Well, they were scrapped.
Well, we deferred. I think the position is it's a deferral of the Fire and Emergency Service Levy. And
well, you repealed the legislation. I mean, the Parliament repealed the legislation. That's not a deferral.
Well, I think we remain committed, as I'm sure you do. I would say, Mr. Searle, we're on a unity ticket here in the sense that we believe...
Oh, don't bring me into your mess, Mr. Treasurer. I mean, this is all yours.
Well, no, I think...
No, you're right. You've got to share it with the President.
So you're going to let him ask the question, or just going to have a chat?
Well, no, I mean, let's... Well,
I think the Treasurer can look after himself.
We'll let the Treasurer answer the question.
We'll stoke the fire over there, fireside chat.
Look, there is no doubt, as you're aware, we deferred the levy. As part of that, we returned to the collection of the levy on insurance premiums. Look, we still take the view and that a collection of this levy on insurance premiums is not the most efficient way, nor is it fair. But clearly, as the data came through as part of this process, that the lived experience did not match the policy intent. And I'm very proud to be part of a government that has embarked on a number of reforms. And the reality is, when you are an active government, constantly making decisions in the best interests of the people of New South Wales, you won't always get it right. And I've said in relation to this reform, on this occasion, we didn't get it right. And what we will continue to do, though, is embark on reform and embark on making decisions that are in the best interest of the people of New South Wales, and we'll continue to do that.
Treasurer, you described the reform as, in some ways, a very simple reform, and you certainly didn't rush into it. When your government put out its first discussion paper in 2012, 3 years later, the then Treasurer announces the levy. The following June, you appoint the monitor. April, you legislate, and then suddenly May, you announce it's going to be scrapped. And then following, well, the Parliament then repealed the legislation, and in fact, in June of this year, you had to introduce legislation to bring back the former scheme. That's not a deferral, that's a complete capitulation. There was no lived experience because your policy was never implemented. So can you tell us, how did you get it so wrong? And what did you get wrong? What was it that caused you to scrap the policy?
So, in relation to simple, your reference to the term simple, I would say, it's a simple concept.
But you got it wrong.
I mean, I've said that. I said we've got it wrong, and this is a government that may have got this reform. We could have obviously had a better result. There's no hiding that, but we've got the big things right, and that's why we're in a strong financial position. And it's great to be here at budget estimates for the Treasurer in a circumstance where we have a budget, as I've said, is the envy of the Western world, with a $4.5 billion surplus, and a surplus that we certainly wouldn't have in circumstances where we've had in circumstances where the Labor Party has opposed every one of our reforms. In terms of your reference to the lived experience.
Well, those were your words just a moment ago, Treasurer.
Okay, your reference to my words of the lived experience in circumstances where the reform had not been implemented. That certainly came to light because one of the key tenets of this government is being an open and transparent government. It's something that we certainly pride ourselves very much on. And as part of this reform process, we advertised and ran a campaign to inform the public of this change. And as part of that, we put online a calculator and people, both business owners, those in connection with industry, as well as homeowners, were given obviously the opportunity to inform themselves of what the change would be. And it became quite clear to me as Treasurer and to the government that the outcome based on the data that was coming through fell outside the intention of the government's objectives with this policy.
Okay, well, that raises the question I asked a moment ago.
Yeah.
You didn't rush into this reform. Your government took 5 years to design it, craft it. You had all the firepower of the New South Wales Treasury to assist you.
World-class Treasury.
I acknowledge you say that, and yet it was completely wrong. Or you say the modelling was just completely wrong compared to the lived experience. So
Well,
how did it get so wrong?
So what I would say is, in relation to that question, is that there was a challenge in terms of, through this process, in getting 100% of the data. Obviously, you're transitioning from a system where the levy is being paid on insurance policies and transferring that to a system where it is being transitioned to land value. Now, in circumstances where we were unable to get 100% or a clear 100% sample, and that's going to be the case in any reform. I take that point. It's going to be the case in any reform. You make assumptions based on the data that you receive. I would say that the outlying position in the fluctuations for particularly the industrial and the commercial side was outside the scope of what we believed it would be. Sure, as you say, this is not a policy we rushed into. It was one that had taken some time. The model is the model, but the data that came out of that at the back end as we approached the implementation date, being July 1 of this year, it was outside of what I was comfortable and what the government was comfortable in implementing. And as a result, we made the decision to hit the pause button. And I believe that was the right decision to make. And sometimes in government, you're not going to get everything right, and you've got to make the right decision based on the situation in front of you. And based on the data that I received, the government formed the view that we should defer the implementation of the Fire and Emergency Services Levy.
Now, Treasurer, you inherited the project from the former Treasurer. Would you have embraced this model yourself if you'd been bringing it forward?
The position in relation to this reform, as I've said before, is that the government remains completely behind the principle.
Well, I meant the legislation, really.
Well, I introduced the enabling legislation as Treasurer, probably sometime, it would have been March or April.
April.
Yeah. So I introduced the legislation. It is my legislation as Treasurer of New South Wales, and following the introduction of the legislation, as the data came through, it became clear to me. I would say it became clear to the government that the outcome was not what we intended at the outset.
So when you said the outcome wasn't what you intended and the lived experience was falling outside your expectations, was that people were contacting the government because they were going to be paying too much, a lot more than they had previously been paid?
We received a range of correspondence during the time, particularly at the time that the calculator, the Fire and Emergency Services calculator, went online, which I think was a positive step, and it was quite good. It was the right move. The government did that because if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't. I think that was probably the mechanism which provided the information to come through to the government to make the decision on deferral. My office received a range of correspondence. I had members of Parliament, obviously, a number of them, raising their concerns with me based on their constituents, and that always gives you faith in the political system that constituents raise their issues with the local members, and local members then can take that to the minister. I heard those concerns. I considered the situation for some time to work through those issues, and reached the conclusion that the government should defer the levy at this time.
We're having this debate about whether you've scrapped it or whether you've deferred it, and you keep using the word deferral.
Well,
when is it deferred until? Exactly.
Well, the Fire and Emergency Services Levy, in its as proposed, I would say is, to use the words of the great former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, dead, buried, and cremated. What I would say is that.
So not deferred.
What I would say is that the principle, which I believe we're on a unity ticket on, and I think, as I said, I think the Greens are too, that the paying for, which concerns me, that the principle behind what is deferred is moving away from a system whereby the levy is calculated on insurance premiums. I just do not believe, and the government does not believe, that it is a fair system that only people who take out insurance pay for the important work that our emergency services personnel do. But what I would like to see is a system where everybody makes a contribution and the tax burden across New South Wales is reduced, because that's what this government has a strong reputation in doing.
So just to be clear, you're still working on a model of changing the fire and emergency service arrangements?
What I'm working on at the moment is ensuring that the implementation and the continuation of the emergency services levy paid on premiums is continued, and we have a smooth transition into as we continue that point of collection.
What do you mean back to the future? You know,
Well,
the system that was in place beforehand.
We'll continue the current arrangements, let's say.
Yeah, well, there's not much to do there. They're back in place.
Well, I've been working with the insurance companies and meeting with them to make sure that they've obviously they're obviously a key stakeholder in this reform. So I've been making sure that a focus of mine has been that there's a smooth continuation of the current system.
So after 6 years, we're back where we started from. That's essentially what you're saying now.
We're back where we were. We're back where we were collecting it on insurance premiums.
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Okay, I'm glad we got that clear. Now, you mentioned the insurance industry. Now, they've said it's cost, this whole adventure of yours has cost them tens of millions of dollars.
The reform process.
Well, the reform process, the new legislation and then scrapping it and going back to the old scheme, the sort of chopping and changing, they said it's cost them tens of millions of dollars. Have they indicated to you how they're going to recoup those losses? And will they recoup them from their customers, who will then be paying more?
I've had a very, very constructive discussion with the insurance companies, with the Insurance Council, and obviously some of those conversations were tough conversations, as you would imagine, in circumstances where you defer, where you've been working on a reform process, to be completely honest, and they have obviously been working towards that too. I want to thank them actually, because I think that they have, in what would have been a difficult situation for them, obviously, and that they have worked closely with the government in relation to continuing the collection of ESL. I've met with the Insurance Council a number of times, and I'll continue to meet with the insurance companies. It's not for me to direct the insurance companies to do one thing or another. They're in the private sector. They're in a competitive environment, and they'll continue to collect the emergency services levy. We have said that no person should be worse off as a result of the continuation of the ESL, and that's our position.
Well, you're using some pretty tricky language there, Treasurer. I mean, you created this big change. You caused the insurance industry to incur costs by switching twice to a new scheme and then back. And you're saying, well, no one should have to pay more as a result of that. But these are commercial players. They've incurred costs to them as a result of your government's actions. How can you guarantee that they won't pass those costs on to households and business customers who will then be paying more as a result of your government's bungling?
Well, as a result of the deferral of the Fire and Emergency Services Levy.
You mean the scrapping? I mean, I think you'd agree that legislation is dead and buried, correct?
Yes.
So the FESL has been scrapped. It's not deferred.
FESL in its known form is now dead, buried, and cremated.
Okay, so we're moving from the known knowns to the unknown knowns. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I've been completely consistent in my position that the principle of moving away from a levy on insurance we are completely committed to. Therefore, the costs incurred by the insurance companies is not in vain.
That's a ridiculous proposition, Treasurer. But, well, the scheme you got them to expend money switching to has been scrapped. Whatever you might do in the future could look entirely different and would require more work on the part.
Well, that's a hypothetical.
Well, you're right, it's a hypothetical, because I mean, will you even introduce a new scheme before March 2019, or is it sort of on the never-never? As I said, Mr.
Searle, I'm trying to answer the questions as well as I can here.
You're struggling, Treasurer.
That's whether you can decipher a question from it.
We remain completely committed to moving away from a levy on insurance companies. The current system in place, or the proposal in place that came through as part of that, we have said we will not pursue.
Okay. But you won't guarantee that the insurance companies won't pass on those costs they have incurred to their customers, households and businesses.
I've had some very constructive discussions with the insurance companies, and the experience to date so far is that, and some from preliminary figures that I have seen from the insurance companies, that the lived experience in terms of what premium holders were paying before is in line with what they were paying previously. So if you have specific questions you want to ask the insurance companies, feel free to do that. As part of this, I would say as well that the government's commitment is that no policyholder should be worse off, and I've continued the role of the insurance monitor, Alan Fells, through this process. I haven't got the date for the period of time.
Mid-2020.
To mid-2020, which I believe is a reasonable period of time, just to make sure that they continue to monitor the fact that he will continue to play the important role and the good work that he is doing in ensuring that policyholders are not worse off as a result of the government's deferral of this reform.
Well, it's very courageous of you to keep using that word deferral in the face of the evidence, Treasurer. In relation to Professor Fells, the main purpose of the monitor was to oversee the transition to the new Fire and Emergency Services Levy. And you've agreed that that legislation and that model has been scrapped, is dead and buried.
Yeah.
So why are you continuing to engage Professor Fells and indeed David Cousins in their roles monitoring? What exactly are they monitoring? Are they just monitoring to make sure that no one pays more as a result of your government's disastrous policy? Are they sweeping up after you? Is that what their job is now?
Well, no. Well, I mean, I reject the proposition of this disastrous policy. I mean, I think that the principle behind the reform remains completely valid, and as I say, the government is committed to that. The insurance monitor has done I think, some significant work for the government over a period of time in relation to the protection of consumers in a range of areas. My experience with Professor Fells has generally been very positive, and I think I certainly made the decision, particularly in the early stages when we went down this path of deferring, that it made sense to me to just continue his engagement for the protection of consumers. And obviously, he's a government that wants to make sure that consumers across New South Wales are given as much protection as possible. I decided to continue his engagement with the New South Wales government at this time.
We'll move on.
How was it that other organisations were able to work out the flaws in your government's model for the FESL, and it took your Treasury and your government so long to catch up?
Well, once it became obviously the value in the period of time leading into the implementation date being July 1, the Valuer General conducted the valuations across the state of land values, on the unimproved land values across New South Wales. We then set out an information campaign in relation to the introduction of the Fire and Emergency Services Levy, which I believed at the time was quite important given the nature of the change, by then setting up a calculator which allowed people to, I guess, put in their information in respect of their current circumstances. We, as a result of that approach, that's where the feedback came from, and that feedback came back to the state. And once that feedback came through, I made the decision, or the government made the decision, to defer the levy. So you have a model, but you have so the model is based. The model, Mr. Searle, is based. So the model is the model. The data is based on the information that goes into that model. When you don't have a perfect set of data, then we made assumptions of what we believed would result. And as I've said numerous times, the lived experience that came through that process was not in line with what we expected it to achieve. That is the reason. And to Mr. Mookie's point, that is the sole reason. We deferred the emergency services.
Has local government asked your government to pay them money to compensate for the costs they've incurred for your botched scheme?
Local government have been compensated for all of the implementation costs associated with the reform.
How much?
This was part of the overall implementation arrangements for the reform. In terms of the overall payments made to local government,
I'm happy for you to take that on notice and to provide us the figures by local council area, if you can.
Yeah, we'll take that on notice.
Thanks. Treasurer, a Transport for New South Wales document received by the opposition dated April this year gave an estimated total cost for the Sydney Gateway project as being between $1 to $1.8 billion. But in your budget's infrastructure statement handed down 2 months later, you gave the estimated total cost at only $800 million. Can you explain the $1 billion discrepancy, please?
So which document's this?
This is there was a Transport for New South Wales cluster report dated April, which we obtained. It was reported widely in the media, you might recall, saying that the Sydney Gateway project, had blown out to $1 to $1.8 billion. But in the your infrastructure statement says it's only $800 million. So can you explain the difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's I guess I found quite frustrating as a treasurer over the last period of time, and obviously taking a keen interest in the media reporting in relation to a number of these documents that seem to be floating around, which I think is quite unfortunate for all. Is that there seems to be a misconception in respect of what a reservation is, as opposed to a final business case and a final costing of the project. So
you accept that it is 1.8?
No, I don't. Because we are in relation to that project. we have set as part of the WestConnex budget, which is at $16.8 billion, an $800 million reservation because that project is obviously connected to and very related to the WestConnex project, an $800 million reservation. Now, we set any strong financial manager when you have a significant pipeline of infrastructure projects will set aside a reservation in advance. So one of the other ones I think I read recently was the Circular Quay wharves that you had raised, and as the portfolio minister at the time, we had set aside, my recollection was about $200 million for the redevelopment of the Circular Quay wharves, which will be a fantastic project when it comes online.
Yeah, I think that one was estimated to be a total of $455 million. It's now blown out to $1.2 billion.
Yeah, so this is obviously shows the fact that on your side, look. I mean, I accept that the Labor Party never built any infrastructure in New South Wales, and I do. I remember reading at the time in 2011 the review into the Labor Party's performance at that election, which obviously didn't go so well. And in that
point of order, Mr. Chair, the minister has been completely unresponsive to the question. We're not talking about 2011. We're talking about the 2017-18 budget and these projects.
All right, I'll get back. I accept the point of order, and I'm trying to move. I'll move back as quickly as I can. It's just relevant, Mr. Chair, to the point that when Labor is talking about these so-called blowouts, they're not blowouts at all. Well, because they are reservations that we set aside funding for. You can't sit there at the outset of a project and say we are going to build these new wharves or a major motorway or a new rail infrastructure and overnight have a determination of what the final cost is. That is not how building infrastructure works. This is not a game of SimCity where you press a button and build a hospital and wake up the next morning and there it is. You go through a substantial process of construction of infrastructure. There's planning phases, there's final business cases, there's investment decisions, it comes to ERC, and what good government does is it sets aside provisions to fund those projects into the future.
Okay,
and
Treasurer.
what we have done in relation to, specifically to the question, Mr. Searle, what we have done in relation to Sydney Gateway is make a reservation of $800 million for that project, which I believe is due to be constructed sometime in 2023. Is that 2020? I think it's 2023 in six years' time.
Yeah, Treasurer, I think you're talking about different things. Reservations are one thing, and I do understand how the reservations process. But when you're doing any project, it's not a blank cheque. It's not like we'll spend any amount of money on this project. Governments usually say the project will cost this amount of dollars. So if you're looking at WestConnex, for example, your government said the project in total would cost $10 billion. That wasn't a reservation. That was a total estimated cost. And it's now accepted that it's about $18 billion. So that has blown out.
16.8, but there's been substantial...
Well, 16.8, 17 billion. It'll be 17 billion before you're finished.
But I would say that there's been substantial changes to the scope of that project. And unlike projects, I would call a blowout, I mean, we can have a definition of blowouts. I'd call a blowout...
Well, you're spending more than you said you'd spend.
I'd call blowout like I'm going to build a Rozelle Metro, for example, and that cost, let's say, $500 million. I said it, I don't say this is the total cost of the project, but I spend $500 million and then not build it.
So,
I would probably say that's
Treasury?
a blowout.
What is the Treasury, Mr. Searle?
Treasurer, your government has privatised over $50 billion of public assets over the last 6 years.
Government assets.
Government assets. And yesterday, I think the Finance Minister said the government held $142 billion in public assets. That means you've privatised something like 26% of total government holdings. Is that about right? Or if that's not, what figure do you say?
I can check. I can get...
Happy for you to take that on.
Well, hold on. I can take the figure on notice, but I'm not going to accept the proposition or the direction of the question, I notice, because the net worth of the state in the budget papers, which I think, and I note that there seems to be some issue that's raised in respect of the amount that, of assets that have been divested. But that's only one side of the story, Mr. Searle, because as part of asset recycling, we are investing in future infrastructure as well. And a core part of the budget that I announced, which unfortunately, I mean, obviously you have your little pet favourite parts of the budget that don't get taken up, but for me, the fact that we will be the first state over the forward estimates to have a net worth of $250 billion is quite significant. And if you, I refer members of the Labor Party, and I know the Shadow Treasurer will be particularly interested in this, that in Budget Paper 1 on 7-9, there's a chart 7.6 which shows the average growth, the annual average growth in general government sector net worth in mainland states from 2016 to 2021. New South Wales is substantially ahead, and you'll look at that growth well above 8%. And look at our Labor counterparts in Victoria, who, to their credit, as I said, they're followers, they're at 4%. But look at these other states, and we are not just pioneering asset recycling, the actual wealth and net worth of this state continues to grow.
Here.
Treasurer, are you concerned that recurrent expenditure commitments are very reliant on stamp duty income? If the property market cools, how do you intend to make up for lost revenue?
It's a very good question, Mr. Searle. And thank you for it. There is no doubt, and as Treasurer of the State, I have we strongly monitor our sources of revenue, and in particular, we need to make sure that we live within our means. And we've enshrined in law the Fiscal Responsibility Act, where we, one, need to maintain a AAA credit rating, secondly, have our expense growth below long-term revenue growth at 5.6%. It was at 5% in the current budget, and that we meet our long-term unfunded superannuation liabilities by 2030. Now, in respect of stamp duty, the residential stamp duty component of total revenues is around 9% at $7 billion. We would see that the record number of completions over the last 12 months. Retract that. The record number of approvals over the last 12 months will now translate into record numbers of construction dwellings. As I said, we expect that we will hit a record
but
of
if stamp duty
70,000.
drops, would you consider, for example, a switch to land tax? I mean, how are you going to make up for any shortfalls if stamp duty dips?
I mean, firstly, that is a hypothetical. Secondly, we would see stamp duty obviously being a strong component of our revenue base. We won't see it increasing at the same rate. We don't project it, and Caroline might make some further comments, but we wouldn't see it, I guess, increasing at the rates that we have seen in most recent times. But on two counts, one, we see, whilst that is the case, we still see stamp duty providing a strong contribution to our revenues, and importantly though, it sits only at, whilst not insignificant, it sits there at 9%. What would concern me more actually is the GST component, in the sense that we would really want reform there to protect that base going forward. But Carol, do you want to make some wider comments in relation to projections on stamp duty, particularly residential stamp duty?
Certainly, Treasurer. It is absolutely the case that the property market has been growing at very high levels for a number of years now, and that's been reflected in stamp duty growth. Over the last year, stamp duties, residential stamp duties were estimated to grow by about 9.6% in our 17-18 budget. We are expecting stamp duty growth to moderate across the budget and forward estimates period. Residential stamp duties are forecast to grow at 5.4% on average across the budget and forward estimates period. That's reflecting some slowdowns in the overall property market, but still at robust levels. We're expecting to see more of the impact of tightened lending standards and macroprudential policies at the Commonwealth level, as well as, of course, an expectation of interest rate rises, albeit off very low levels. But nonetheless, we are expecting the market to still grow at more moderate levels, supported by a very strong supply pipeline from government, supported by government policies, as well as strong population growth and still interest rates at relatively low levels.
Okay, Treasurer, what further privatisations or sales of public assets do you have planned over the next 19 months?
The two projects that I could refer to in answer to your question would be the WestConnex transaction. We have made a decision to sell 51% of SMC, which will assist in funding stage 3 of the WestConnex project. The other one, which you would be aware of, is the Snowy Hydro decision to sell up.
Nationalisation of Snowy Hydro.
Well, the nationalisation of the Snowy 2.0 pursuit. So I understand that the Labor opposition is supporting that transaction. I've been meeting
Snowy Hydro.
Snowy Hydro, yes. I have been, as Treasurer, we're working very closely with the Victorian government. In fact, I met with Tim Pallas last week, I think, specifically in relation to that, because obviously we have a common interest in making sure that whatever decision is made, that we will make, that if we were to sell, we haven't committed to selling, we are in negotiations, and we will not be making a decision in respect of that sale unless it's in the interests of the state, and the Victorian government shares that perspective.
Okay. The Finance Minister said there was over $1 billion of further property sales planned. You agree? You don't disagree with that? That's about right? So is that the total list of privatisations you've got prepared for the next?
Oh, so are you including? So I'm talking more transactions. Okay. Did you want to expand that definition?
I'm happy for you to take that on notice to give us sort of total government.
Like assets.
Yeah, total
like,
assets.
For example, an old fire station would count as an asset sale.
If you're going to sell that, yes. I'm happy for you to take that on notice. It's not
because I see this is. I'll take that on notice, and I'll liaise with the finance minister. But once again, Mr. Searle, I see this as a really key, important point about the government's asset recycling scheme, because I think it is unfair that the Labor Party focus on the sale, but not the investment. And we're seeing the net worth. And I remember Michael Daly, who was the former Shadow Treasurer, came out to Windsor and made an announcement that we were selling a fire station, but didn't actually inform the public that we had just built a new state-of-the-art fire station just down the road.
I'm shocked.
So what I would ask...
How could he forget that?
Well, what I would ask is that we don't politicise this and focus just on the sale. Let's focus on the investment and the infrastructure spend that we're able to embark on as a result of the government's approach. And I draw both Mr. Searle, your attention back, and the committee and the public's attention back to the fact that the net worth of this state is growing at a much greater rate than any other state in the nation, and within the next 4 years we will have a net worth of close to $250 billion, and that is something that we are very proud of.
With the sale of the electricity companies, and I think also with SMC, your government is retaining a so-called golden share or golden vote over certain issues like dividend payments and capital structures and stuff like that. Is that correct, that you did retain it for the state-owned electricity companies and that you are proposing to do so for SMC?
Well, we will receive, I'm not going to go into commercial in confidence negotiations in relation to the SMC WestConnex transaction, but in respect of the electricity distribution networks, obviously we leased 100% of Transgrid, but the shareholding in both Ausgrid and Endeavour enables the state to share in the dividends that come from those businesses, and in those businesses, and in relation to SMC, those matters are commercial in confidence, but it would be the case that we would share in the uplift by maintaining a 49% shareholding of the SMC.
Okay. Over the last couple of years, I've asked questions of the Treasurer about the cost of the challenge to the AER determination led by Ausgrid, Endeavour and Essential Energy.
Yeah.
As of last year, it was $2.3 million. Could you provide the total cost, now that those proceedings are finalised, can you provide the total cost of the challenge to the AER determination?
Are you happy if I take that on notice?
I'm happy for you to take it on notice. And when you provide a global figure, can you also break that down into barrister or legal firms, consultants, all the constituent amounts that you've got? In
relation to the
AER challenge?
Yeah.
And can you also, and I'm happy for you to take this on notice as well, to inform the committee of the total transaction costs for the sale, or as you would put it, the long-term lease of Transgrid, Ausgrid and Endeavour? So the total transaction costs.
Oh, yeah. I can give them to you now. Then.
Okay, and can you also break that down to strategic and financial advice, legal advice, PR, advertising, probity services, all the constituent parts that make up that total figure?
Yeah, I might pass to the Secretary because I think he would have...
Yep.
Do we have access to the breakdown of the costs?
So again, if you don't have them to hand, I'm happy
the actual breakdown of the cost to the individual advisor level is published on the Crown accounts, and that's a final audited number, so I would refer you to those.
Okay. Be sure you do. I mean, no disrespect, but sometimes when I've been referred off to websites or documents, you go to the source document and the figures are not there. So just...
Okay.
If you're going to refer me off to something else.
Well, I wouldn't want to do that, Mr. Searle.
No, of course
I'd want to give you. I would want to give you the most accurate. And Mr. Primrose knows all too well in relation to property assets and transparency in relation to those sales from my time in finance, that we take that very seriously.
Yes, I accept that. The problem is Mr. Searle's indicated, often those figures aren't there when you actually go to the site.
Okay, well, if not, we'll come back to you.
So, if we, look, this doesn't. We might be taking some time to find those.
No,
but if you're,
I can move on to the next question.
All right.
Now, I've got another question then through you, Treasurer,
That's fine.
to Mr. Bhatia, whom I asked to come along. And now, iCare, of course, is the workers' compensation insurer. It does other things, but that's one of its roles. And by the end of the year, I think something like 6,500 persons, injured persons, will be exiting the workers' compensation system. Yes. Is that understanding correct?
Are you happy if I answer that?
Of course.
Yeah.
And then when you do answer that, if that figure is correct, what is going to happen to those 6,500 people? How many are going to the NDIS?
Yep.
How many are going on to DSP?
Yep.
And what will happen to the balance of people?
Okay, so I'll provide an overview and then I'll pass for that specific detail to Mr. Bhatia. But obviously, as part of the Section 39, as part of the Coalition's 2012 workers' compensation reforms, those who had a whole person impairment of less than 20% would be transitioned out of the workers' compensation scheme.
Or as we like to say, cut off.
Well, I would use the term transitioned out after, let's say, 5-year period. It's important to note that those, the injured workers who have a whole person impairment of less than 10% will still receive medical benefits for 2 years, and those injured workers who have a whole person impairment above that to 20% would receive medical benefits for an additional 5 years. And before I pass to Mr. Bhatia in relation to provide some further detail, because I think this is a very important line of questioning.
Including the numbers of people.
And we can provide the numbers of people. I mean, I can provide that to you now. CIRA, which now falls within the purview of the Minister of Finance, Services and Property, estimates that 4,500 workers will exit the scheme between September 2017 and June 2018. This includes the iCare normal insurer, the iCare TMF, and self and specialised insurers. In addition, this includes the pre-October 2012 cohort, as well as those injured immediately after. 3,400 workers with the iCare normal insurer will have payments cease between October 17 and June 18. 390 workers with iCare TMF will have their weekly compensation payments end between October 17 and 18. And the balance of those are with the self and specialised insurers outside of government. The point I would like to make before passing to Mr. Perrottet to provide further detail, because this is important, is that when we made some changes, as you'd be aware, to the scheme in 2015, I think it was early 2015, post-election 2015, was that we extended benefits as well to those injured workers who may have a whole person impairment at any stage, but let's say under 20% as well, to provide prosthetics for life and hearing aids for life.
I think you did that initially by regulation and then followed it up with
Right,
legislation.
okay. And as part of that as well, we increased medical benefits for life for those who have a whole person impairment of above 21%. Importantly, when we, as part of that reform, we established iCare, because what had struck me when I was in the finance portfolio was that we have a range of political discussion and debates around entitlements versus premiums. But what was of significant concern to me when I met with a range of injured workers, and including meeting with the Injured Support Workers Network, who we don't necessarily agree all the time, but what had come through was that we needed to provide greater service and support around injured workers. And under the previous scheme, there wouldn't have been that support there. So under iCare, which I'd ask Vivek to talk about, because there is no doubt that this has been a 5-year period. We're coming closer to that period of time.
October.
We're coming closer to that period of time, and I know that from my time in finance to today, that work that iCare has made has run significant programs to provide support for those injured workers, and I think it's important that Mr. Perrottet provides that information.
Thank you, Treasurer. Thank you for the question, Mr. Searle. As you know, we're talking about a number of people, and they're individuals. They have individual circumstances. A person who is 42 versus 55, living in regional versus metro, has very different circumstances, and how we support them through this transition is obviously a critical need. We're also aware that we act within the legislative framework. Our role is to make sure that we can transition these individuals and provide them whatever support that is necessary. As a result, what we have done is put together an advisory assistance framework where we are staffed by allied health professionals, by psychologists, and to date we have had more than 600 people that we have spoken with on a regular basis, trying to transition them, finding the support networks within the community which are of extreme significance. When individuals, as you very well know, stay on the scheme for a period of time, there is a social isolation element, there's a community isolation element, but there's also a lack of self-confidence which then stops them from going back into doing activities that actually were either vocational or work-related. And the plan of the AAS is to actually try and help them through that process. But also through partnerships with Uniting and Vinnie's, what we have done is we have put experienced case managers for community transition for those individuals. The thing that I like to say is that there are 600 people that we have had the conversation with. I would like that to be 3,000, because those are the people impacted. But we are trying to gain trust. These individuals have had an issue of trust with systems in the predecessor organizations. And we are working really hard to make sure that as an organization which is human-centered, which is focusing on the individual requirements of these people and their carers, we are trying to help them through the situation as best as we can. We are also making sure that these individuals are connected to the other community support systems, whether it be Centrelink, through disability systems, or through other vocational courses where we can help them through transition processes.
Thank you, Chair.
Just quickly, Mr. Chair. Sorry, Mr. Good. We have those figures. If you would like to very briefly provide them.
Happy to put them on notice. Okay. I don't want to take up any more of Mr. Field's time.